Okay, so welcome all of you. Thanks so much for being with us today. This is the 2021 Historic Preservation Commission Annual Retreat. Um, so uh, we have today Beth King from North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. She's the Architectural Survey Coordinator and is therefore the perfect person to talk with us about topics of recent interest, particularly updating our survey, our architectural inventory for each of the districts to include potentially properties that are currently non-contributing from the mid-century era. So as you all know, the last inventory took place in 2015. Our policy is to update every 10 years. That's what we have the commitment and manpower to do. And so our next inventory update is planned for 2025. So we have a little bit of time to plan how we'll go about that process. And we're hoping that Ms. King will help us guide us in considering what we need for that update. And then our next speaker is our very own Krista Kukuro, and she'll be reviewing quasi-judicial procedure and touching on some other legal topics and answering any questions that you have about that. So this is our first retreat that's in virtual format, and I apologize that we couldn't make arrangements for the coffee and the bagels like we usually do, but I hope that everyone is comfortable and as excited to be here as we are to have you here. So let's go ahead and begin. Beth and Krista, also, we're grateful for your presentation this morning. And so if Beth, if you'd like to start, I think we're ready.
Sure. Well, what questions do you have? I don't have a formal presentation of any material. So just let me know what you'd like to talk about.
Okay, sure. So maybe I should give you some background about what we have. Would anybody else like to give the background, or I can also do it?
I'll provide a couple comments.
Okay, go for it.
Hey, Beth, Matt Bouchard here. Thanks so much for being with us this morning. I think one of the recent frustrations we've had as a commission, and maybe frustration is a strong word. One of the challenges we've had in recent months is dealing with demolition certificates for appropriateness and trying to determine whether or not we should impose a 365 day or shorter delay on those planned demolitions for properties that some of us commissioners feel should be preserved, but are not currently part of the inventory for a given neighborhood. They're outside the period of significance as those neighborhoods were initially qualified for our commission's jurisdiction. And so I speak just for myself. I certainly don't speak for Katie or Andy, but I'm curious to know sort of what the process looks like for reviewing the inventory and making determinations about, okay, this neighborhood might have had its period of significance from the 1900s to 1945, but now we think that there's value in terms of the fabric of the neighborhood to preserving some of those, mid-century ranch and other properties because they have value too. So we've really, struggled to have those discussions in reviewing some demolition applications. I suspect if we don't conduct another inventory until 2025, we're going to continue to have challenges on some of these demolition requests. But if you could just give us some background as to what it's going to look like in any role or input this commission might have in terms of looking at the inventory, looking at the so-called non-contributing structures in the neighborhoods that we currently have jurisdiction over, and making some determinations about whether or not criteria for what constituted a contributing property might need to be adjusted during the next inventory review process. And I open up the floor to others to provide their perspectives. Thank you.
Okay, well that's a great question, and I apologize to initially answering your question with another question, but I do want to ask about this 10-year update of your inventory, because as far as the architectural survey records that we keep here in the state, Durham hasn't done an update since 1980. So that's one of the big challenges, especially when we work with developers, is that almost all of your historic districts were listed in the 80s. And so often that period of significance is cutting off in either the 30s or right up to World War II. And there hasn't been any survey updates in 40 years. So we don't have another large city in the state that has gone that long without any kind of survey update. So when you all say that you're updating your survey every 10 years, what is that looking like? Because it hasn't made it to us. So we don't have any corresponding records.
So there might be some, this is Grace, Carla, there might be some confusion about nomenclature here. I'm thinking that survey versus inventory or preservation plan. So I'm going back and looking at our criteria right now. I'm not sure that we've done an architectural survey update, but we have looked at our preservation plans in the last, few different decades. I know we just looked at our preservation plans back in when we adopted the consolidated criteria in 2016. So we went back and took pictures of all of our inventory and tried to make sure there weren't any mistakes with contributing versus non-contributing. But I don't know if there's a difference in what Beth is talking about and what we're talking about. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you. That helps. But I think one of the big issues, and it is a tall order at this point, but the architectural inventory is so out of date at this point that it doesn't really consider anything that was built after World War II. So one of the challenges to identify eligible, post-war neighborhoods in Durham would be that there's not a comprehensive sense of how Durham developed after that time, and we don't have good comparison properties. For example, if a constituent came to us and said, my neighborhood's really cool and it developed over the course of the 60s, and do you think it could be eligible for the National Register? We can look at that neighborhood and try to assess the degree of integrity that it retains within itself, but we don't have comparison data on any other neighborhoods in the city. And so when it comes to answering questions of, is this really the most significant, or is this one of the most significant neighborhoods? We can't answer questions like that without having a full picture of what was happening in Durham. So I think that's also going to be a big challenge to extending periods of significance in your registered historic districts, which is something that you would have to do through a formal amendment to the nomination if you wanted to potentially move some properties from non-contributing just due to their age to contributing. You would need to revisit the nomination and develop probably both new areas of significance and also develop context for the architecture from the later years of development.
And just to clarify, we are talking about the local districts and not the National Register.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, the local districts, then I think that you just need to do enough research to determine how you want to proceed at the local level. I mean, you're not really answerable in the same way to the state or the federal government. So I think that's a matter of amassing enough information locally that you can make a decision about, what you want your local districts to look like.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that we've been struggling with is currently in our local preservation plans, the 1950s and 60s structures are called out as infill, not consistent with the architecture of the period of significance. So how do we make the case for which structures from this expanded era actually do contribute to the character? And I'd be curious to know, just from your experience working with national districts, how do you determine that? And so maybe we could have some carryover, or some applicability to the local districts. I'm just wondering how other jurisdictions have been doing this, if you know of other districts that are expanding their periods of significance, and also how you're doing it for the National Register districts.
Well, I think you need to look at how your argument for significance was made to begin with. And if your whole argument for significance just rests on the fact that a neighborhood was built out, let's just say that the argument states that you've got a neighborhood of fairly cohesive buildings that were all built in the 1920s, and they all represent this style, this period of building, this particular piece of development history. And then you have what would truly be infill, things that were stuck in later. The way that your argument of significance reads now, it is going to be really difficult to say that later development that occurred in sort of like a piecemeal one-off fashion, it is going to be hard to say that that's contributing to the district. But if you can look at your argument for significance and develop context for how the later buildings contribute to the ongoing development of a neighborhood, or different aspects of history in Durham that were developing at a later time, then you might be able to make the argument that those are contributing buildings. That would probably not work very well in a National Register sense, because I think you would have a lot harder time making that argument to the National Park Service. But in a local district, as long as you can develop the context for the justification for saying that those buildings have significance, then I think that you can consider them contributing.
So it's really viewing the infill process itself as significant in terms of the historic character and its evolution.
I think that is probably the case, and I'm really not. I've never had a local district application come back to our office for amendment. We have our 30-day review when something's landmarked or when a district is nominated locally. I've never seen one of those come back with changes or amendments. So I don't know what that process looks like. That would be a great question for Christy Brantley. She may not know either, but someone should be able to help us figure out what that looks like.
So is it fair to say then that the majority of sort of the requests to or the proposals to nominate mid-century structures, it's usually new entire districts that show this character?
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
We did actually get some interest from a mid-century neighborhood back, that was like a year ago. all of their buildings were built around the 50s, and they were interested in local district status. So we gave them the information on that.
Oh, good. I know that Emerywood Estates, at least at one time, was very interested in learning more about being a local historic district, and they have a very active community organization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions regarding this topic specifically?
I came in a little late, so you may have already covered this particular question. Is the state office, or even maybe the state of Secretary of the Interior, or working towards an agenda or amendments to the National Register process? Well, maybe, what am I trying to say? Are you working towards a solution as far as incorporating some of these mid-century homes into these local historic districts?
I don't know that the Park Service is very focused on trying to deal with things that are truly infill in established historic neighborhoods. But I know that we're listing a lot of districts now that are say all built in the 50s or 60s or 70s. Well, not as much the 70s yet, but we're getting there. But I don't know that there's been a lot of attention paid to how to deal with sort of piecemeal one-off additions to established historic districts. Now we have had quite a few districts that have been expanded where the period of significance ended at a certain point, and then there was, say, a later phase of development, maybe 10 years later. So we've expanded some things to incorporate fairly cohesive development that at one point was outside the period of significance. But in terms of just little things sprinkled here and there throughout the district, sometimes when you do a boundary amendment, sometimes you can raise the period of significance to pull things like that in, but a lot of times that can be really difficult to do because it's perceived to hurt the integrity of the original design for the neighborhood.
Right, because I can see something like that happening if, I don't know, I think more study would need to be done, but I could see something like that happening for infills that are within a certain period, like 1950s and 60s, and there's a significant amount of that within an already established historic district. And then instead of a boundary increase, it would just be somewhat of an amendment incorporating those particular types of housings. Also, seeing that now those people are applying to be, that period of housing is applying to be their own districts in other neighborhoods. But I guess we would have to figure that out, and then figure out a threshold maybe so that we're not piecemealing. But if there's a significant amount of this type of infill in a district, I can see something like that. I can see an amendment to what we considered contributing.
Yeah, it sounds like that's something that we could suss out as a commission, maybe next year have a retreat to talk about what we want each district to look like and what which infill we would deem significant to the historic evolution versus others that are more piecemeal, as Beth was saying. Any other questions people have?
I'll just make an observation. I mean, it sounds to me like a lot of this is contextual. A mid-century modern house that's sort of standing on its own in a neighborhood that doesn't feature a whole lot of mid-century houses might not be historically significant from the perspective of that neighborhood and its period of significant development. Whereas Carla, the neighborhood that came to you, looking for information about potentially coming within our jurisdiction, it sounds like that was or is a neighborhood that was, basically developed during the mid 1900s, and in that context, there's significance. I just say it out loud because it's an important point, at least for myself, to just hear myself say it, because I think there's a tendency for me to want to protect properties that I might consider to be historic, have some significance, but maybe not within the context. And so I think it's a helpful distinction and framework within which to think about these issues, which for the next retreat or however we decide to proceed with this issue is, I think, going to create a challenge for us, right? Because neighborhood to neighborhood, if we want to think about looking again at the inventory and consider amendments to the historic preservation plans, there's not going to be a whole lot of consistency, I don't think, from neighborhood to neighborhood. Any amendments we think might be worthwhile or justified or warranted in one neighborhood might not necessarily be the case in the next. And so it strikes me this would not be a linear process, but I still think it's a useful discussion for us to have. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, that that historic districts, whether they're a national register or local, there's not a one size fits all prescription. It's very, very contextual, and it's all about being able to make the argument that what could be intrusive infill in one location for whatever reason based on historic context is just a natural development and a natural continuation of a story in another part of town. So that's one of the reasons, that we spend so much time having these long conversations and hand wringing and thinking about process and looking to see what other communities have done, because it is so, it is a process to really wade through and not necessarily run through.
I think that's all really helpful.
I see on the list of questions that we wanted to talk about the study list. Would you like me to just give an overview of that?
Sure, that would be
Okay.
helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so the study list is the part of the National Register process that is unique to North Carolina. There are other states that have a functionally very similar process, but this is not something that's done at the national level, and it's not something that is done in this exact same way by other states. The study list is in state statute in North Carolina, so we are bound to follow the procedure. It was set up in 1969, so really, really early on. Some of our first National Register nominations were going forward in '68, but they were being done by the Park Service, not by state staff. So really right from the beginning, we've had this procedure in place to help us through the process in North Carolina. So essentially what the study list is intended to do is to be a screening process for properties that appear to be potentially eligible for listing in the National Register. It's not a guarantee that that property will get listed. One, because the National Park Service has the final say on whether something is listed. And also because there's often a gap in time between something getting study listed and then for things that eventually do get listed in the National Register. And a lot of things can happen to a historic property in that gap. But what it means that at the time it was considered, it appeared to possess the qualities that were necessary for listing in the National Register. And as time has moved on, it used to be fairly typical to just say, oh, it's eligible and leave it at that. But as time has moved on, we've tried harder and harder when we study list something to go ahead and define that we see this as a criterion A argument. We see this as a criterion C argument. This is what could be the period of significance. But it's not meant to be an exhaustive deep dive into a property like you do during the National Register process. We're just trying to get our basic facts in line so that when we do get a nomination in a couple years from the study list, we remember why we thought, that it was a good candidate for the National Register to begin with. So it moves through the National Register Advisory Committee in a very similar fashion to a National Register nomination. And the big difference is that the National Register Advisory Committee makes a recommendation to our state historic preservation officer about whether to add or not to add it to the study list. And then the officer makes his decision and it stops there. In the National Register process, the NRAC makes a recommendation to the SHPO. The SHPO makes his final decision, and then it goes to Washington for the final decision. But the study list just stops here in the state. The application, study list application, is not intended to be something that you have to hire a professional to do. We've tried to make it as accessible as we can, and we also offer a lot of hand-holding. So sometimes we'll send an application out and it's about 3 pages long, and it does look intimidating to people. So we try to do a site visit right away to see the property in person and also get to know the applicant a little better, because there are people who hire consultants to do their study list application, but we don't want anyone to feel like, that's a barrier to entry. And we do try to do our, we haven't been able to do so as much during COVID, of course, although we have in recent months started up in a small way. We used to do quite a bit of site visits for study list applications, and for about a year we could not. And we did see a pretty big drop in study list applications during COVID, but things are really starting to crank up again. Let's see. The National Register, a property owner must be involved in the National Register listing process. So we cannot, would not and cannot send anything to NRAC or to Washington where the property owner either objects or is unaware of the National Register process. The study list is a little different because it has, there's no regulatory implications at all for study lists. So a member of the public can submit a study list application for something that they don't own. Now, we strongly encourage, and whenever possible, we facilitate them having that discussion with the owner of the property. But technically, anyone can study list just about anything if they can make the case for it. And that's just simply because the study list is just sort of that pre-screen, and it doesn't afford any extra protection during, say, a Section 106 or a NEPA review. It doesn't qualify you for any grant opportunities or for tax credits. So there's no benefit to the study list in and of itself. It's just that preliminary step towards the National Register. The other thing that's kind of interesting about the study list is that in 1969, no one had the foresight to decide what to do with things that get study listed and then are later demolished. And so there's no mechanism for taking things off the study list. So once something is study listed, it's always study listed. We have things on the study list that burned down 40 years ago, but there's just no mechanism for removing them. So that's one of the little quirks about that program. And please let me know, do you have any questions about anything that I've just said?
Yeah,
I have a maybe more of a technical question. Are you all, I love using the interactive map tool. It's very useful to me. And I'll tell you, I went to DC for a Section 106 training at the, whoever does the training for that. I don't know who it is now, but the people in my class, some of them were consultants, and they bragged about North Carolina was like one of the best states to work with, because they make it easy with the interactive map to find these historic resources when they're consulting with companies about Section 106. So I was glad about that. But one thing I would love is, and I know this is probably just finding someone to do the work, but will we ever have the opportunity when we're clicking on old study listed items, if we need that, will the document link be available anytime soon? Or is that in the works of getting uploaded? Because I think sometimes it's just helpful to have that historic information.
Yes, you're so right. And that's a really great question. So right now, the only thing that's directly linked to our map on HPO Web is National Register nominations. And that's simply because those are public documents. There's no question about it. We have talked about adding study list scanning the study list applications and adding them as a link as well. And the only thing that has caused people to pause a little bit is that sometimes people, well, it's just the idea that people through the years, for almost 50 years or more, I guess, have been sending us these applications and maybe not considering that the photographs and things that they're sending us could be put up on the web. Whereas the whole notion of the National Register is that you're presenting your property with the understanding that it's going to be public record when the process is done. The study list hasn't had that same level of understanding with it. So we have been hesitant to make all of the study list applications and just all of our survey files, because we'd love our survey files to be more accessible to the public. But then we think to ourselves, well, do we really want to give people a roadmap to abandoned properties with beautiful mantles and old hardware and just all kinds of things that people could see online and then go rip off? And yeah, so that's kind of a convoluted response, but I'm going to make sure our National Register coordinator and Ramona Bartos, our administrator, I'm going to make sure that they know that this question was raised, April, and that there's been, because you're not the first person to express interest in that. So I just want them to know we've had another expression of interest, but I know what's holding us up is the idea that property owners may not have necessarily signed up to have that information shared online.
And I didn't think about that. And actually, you made a good point. So now I completely understand the regular process of just emailing and asking for it is probably just a better way, because you're not expected for it to, you don't expect it to be a public document when you're sending a study list. It's more like a draft. And yeah. And so, okay.
And we might be able to figure out a way to redact, like say interior images. If somebody sends us pictures of the inside of their house, we might be able to, it would be a lot more time consuming, than just taking a stack of paper and running it through a scanner. But it might be that we can find a way to pull out information that is more private than say the exterior of someone's house, which almost any place you can see on Google Street View now. So
yeah. Well, and I remember, and the information may not be correct, because I remember I submitted one and I had the wrong date of something of the year built for the building. Because it went through an iteration of changes and I accidentally put the wrong date in there. So I wouldn't want that out because I wouldn't want the wrong information to be out too. So, and
yes,
that stuff gets caught and catched in the study list process.
That's right. You're absolutely right about that. That's the other thing about the study list is we want it to be a process that non-professionals can do, but by that same token, we sometimes get study list applications with kind of crazy, everybody thinks that their building is as old as the deed on the land is. And so, sometimes we get crazy applications for things that are not nearly as old as people think they are. So, whereas with the National Register, there's so much more vetting and typically, not always, but typically those are prepared by a professional who's done, hours of research.
Well, and coming from like the non historic side, like the development side, I know that I have gone to your like Arcgis, which I'm assuming is what April's talking about, the like NC Maps, Arcgis. Yeah, I go to it all the time just to like, obviously I'm in this commission, I care if things are historic, and it's really hard because you'll see like, okay, there's something historic here, but you can't figure out
what it is. So like, even if the like link isn't there, if there was just a like way to contact somebody to just be like, what was historically significant about this property? Because even if the structure's gone, for me as a designer, like there's something nice about having that history and that knowledge moving forward too. Like even if it did get burned down 40 years ago, it would be nice to have, even if, you know, it's a burned down study list thing, finding a way to figure out that information.
So there is a
and-
process. It's basically contacting Chandria Birch at SHPO and asking. So, you know, for everyone that's not familiar, I did post in the chat the link to this map, which it is incredible. Every basically historic resource in North Carolina is on this map. And it has a DH number, which I think stands for Department of History, who's keeping these files.
So DH is just for Durham.
Oh,
So
DH
other
is for
county,
Durham.
like Wake County is WA, Orange
Oh,
County is
okay.
OR. DH is
Perfect.
just Durham's alphanumeric code.
Okay, and
Mhm.
so each of these DH points has a number associated with it, and you email that number to Chandria Birch, who is currently overseeing all of the files, and they literally have a file for each point on that map, and she will send you, she'll scan and send the file via email for any DH number that you request.
Absolutely. And I realize that there, you know, that adds an additional step to it. It's not quite as nice being able to click on something and have self-service, but Chandria will certainly, all of our files are public information. And we are having a lot of conversations about where we can get the money to scan all of our files, so that particularly all of our nowadays we have, you know, a database and everyone uses digital photography. And so we have a lot of born digital material from the last 15 years, I'll say, but we have, our records go all the way back to 69 and 70. So there's 35 years of paper that sits on the shelf. And, you know, our big desire is to have that all scanned and available. So if someone requests it, we can send it out very quickly. But we have 135,000 records around the state, a large portion of which were pre-digital. So it's going to take a big old grant for us to get all of that paper material scanned. So that's what we're in the planning stages for.
Yeah. Anybody have
And
any other?
if we know that something has been demolished, there'll be a black dot, but often things have been demolished that we just maybe haven't heard about, or you know, the map hasn't been updated. So if you find something on the map that's incorrect, sometimes that could be the points a little bit off of where it should be, or something's been demolished. Or occasionally we have people say, well, that's not demolished, it's right here. So if you find a mistake on HPO web, which is, you know, is a thing that can easily happen, you can let us know, we'll correct it.
Yeah, every time we have something that's in the local register, whether it's, well, actually, yeah, basically a local landmark, we notify SHPO that it is gone. So we did that with the Studebaker and Pascal's Bakery building last year or 2 years ago. Yeah. So blending topics, do you have actual MidCentury structures being nominated for the study lists?
We do. In fact, we study listed Emerywood Estates. The pandemic has really made me lose a sense of time. I think it was June 2020, but it may have been. It wasn't the February meeting, so I think it was June 2020 or August. So that's one of the most recent that we've done. We get quite a few now as different communities do survey updates. We'll get quite a few one-off individual modernist houses and churches, particularly in the Charlotte area. There are some really amazing, very high style conceptual modernist churches. and we've study listed quite a few of those. I don't think we've seen any of those move to the National Register yet, but we have had several houses move from study list to National Register, and a few neighborhoods. So we're not getting, we're not inundated with those things, but there is a nice mixture of more recently historic things and older, your more traditional, what people think of when they think of old buildings.
And what do you look at for the mid-century structures specifically? What are you looking for to push it sort of over the edge of significance? Because a lot of mid-century structures do tend to have sort of more utilitarian aesthetic and
yeah. So it a lot of times, if we're looking individually at a modernist residence or church, there's usually the case to be made that the architect's original design and intent and concept is still intact. So it has integrity to criterion C for the design that, and usually like the special design character. We had someone recently asked to study list a minimal traditional brick house, and it really was a very cute, very intact little house, but it was in a neighborhood of 100 houses that looked just like it, and we did not end up study listing it because the applicant had not made a strong enough case for its eligibility. We did think that there was a potential district for all of those houses to be listed as representing significant development at kind of a macro level. But normally, if we're gonna be looking at your plainer, more perfunctory post-war buildings, we're usually going to have to look at the neighborhood level versus at the one-off level, because it's really difficult to say that the house on this street in this neighborhood is eligible without considering the eligibility of all these other things that look just like it and have the identical historical development context. So we do encourage people to think about a lot of post-war and mid-century architecture in terms of its neighborhood potential versus just as a one-off. But that actually has always been the case in historic districts, that even with like big rambly Queen Anne houses, we recently, about 5 years ago, had someone asked to list a house in Zebulon, and it was in the middle of a neighborhood of very similar houses. And so we encouraged them to get their neighbors together to work on a district nomination rather than to try to pursue that individually, because it wasn't really distinct from the neighborhood in which it was cited, and it was not really possible to argue that it was any more significant or any more had better integrity than the things that were around it. It's just we have so many, we had such a building boom after World War II that there's just this sense that there's so much of it. And there is, I'm not denying that, but we've always had to look at things within their neighborhood and assess whether or not they were really any more significant than the buildings around them. We just have to do it on a, times 10 because of all these post-war neighborhoods.
That makes a lot of sense. I think we do have a couple local landmarks. I can think of one in particular, well, two. One on Mangum and one in Forest Hills that are mid-century and definitely unique from the surrounding area. I know we also have some architect designed houses that could form a district sort of in the Duke Forest area. One of the things that I see is becoming problematic in terms of like future COAs for mid-century structures is the integrity of materials. One of the things that we always pride pre-war structures as being is very structurally sound. The dense woods that are used, the just very strong materials in general, except the masonry tends to be softer. But we're always looking to sort of match materials as much as possible and preserving the original. Whereas I think with mid-century structures, there tends to be less structural integrity. They're more fragile. I visited some Frank Lloyd Wright projects that I know there's like the Bethel, there's a synagogue in outside of Philadelphia that literally the ceiling is caving in, the roof is caving in because these materials just aren't lasting. So
this is also a big problem that the General Services Administration as a federal agency is having, because as a federal agency, they're required to follow the Section 106 process whenever a building needs to be repaired or even demolished. And all of a sudden in the last 10 years, they've had all these 1960s office buildings age into being potentially significant historic buildings. And a lot of these buildings have glass curtain wall facades that are failing because the products that are holding that glass in place have been, getting the full force of sunlight, just had sun beating on them for 50 to 60 years now, and they're starting to fail. And so GSA is wrestling with just the financial burden of all of a sudden having all these properties with the same problem that really is an extreme structural problem when the facade of your buildings are curtain wall and your curtain wall is failing. So this is certainly a problem that is coming up more and more in building preservation, is that there are a lot of materials that weren't, either they were brand new materials when they were being used, so people didn't know what the 50-year ramifications were going to be, or there was just an immediate need for construction and things had to be put up quickly. And it's sort of miraculous that some of these things have lasted 50 years. So
yeah, or even unique materials that just haven't stood the test of time before. Right. And all of you, just so you know, this is a very pertinent topic, because we do have a landmark that you're going to see this in the near future that has this issue.
I will say more broadly, we have, there's this feeling that there's so many mid-century neighborhoods, and how do we determine which ones are National Register worthy or local landmark or district worthy. And what we found in some other communities in the Triangle, I'm thinking of Raleigh and also of Cary, is that when you really stop and look at, say, the nice thing about mid-century neighborhoods is your planning office can almost always pull the plat of subdivision for that neighborhood. So you can get a sense of the original extent and the years in which development was built out fairly easily if you're trying to define what the boundaries of this neighborhood are. And just working by plat of subdivision, going into things that were built out all at the same time. Integrity is the big, if everything has the same development history, then most things have a really similar potential area of significance, but integrity seems to be the real deal breaker for a lot of these neighborhoods. So Carrie recently asked me to come and let them know they had picked out 4 or 5 neighborhoods that they thought they might want to survey, and which one did I think they would have the best chance of getting a grant to survey. And really, there was only one that had material integrity. The rest had really had the Joanna Gaines HGTV treatment. They'd all been painted that gray blue, and the windows were dark, the new dark tinting, and the raw wood accents on everything. And that's just not really a mid-century neighborhood anymore. So integrity is often the way things are either making it or breaking it for the National Register. So even though it feels really overwhelming to think how many mid-century neighborhoods you might have in your jurisdiction. Sometimes it's the integrity piece that's really winnowing things out.
That's super helpful. Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. Does anybody have any other questions, whether on topics we've discussed or any other topics to bring up?
So I don't know if this is more of an Elizabeth question or a Carla question, but so my biggest problem with demolition and not being able to deny it is getting everything documented before it gets demolished and getting photos of it. And I know there might be photos from like when it was originally put on, you know, a registry or whatever, but like I'm wondering if there's a mechanism for getting things documented right before they get demolished so that like even if it gets demolished for posterity's sake, we have a record of what it was before, since we don't have the ability to stop it from being demolished. Do we at least have the ability to make sure it gets documented before that happens?
Such an excellent
Grace Smith
question.
here. Katie, that's a great question. I wonder, Carla and Krista, could we require that photos be submitted with an application for demolition? That way it's not on us to actually go out and document. Maybe could we ask the applicant to do that with their application? That doesn't seem very burdensome. Most of the time they do submit photos, but we could be specific about, we want one of each elevation maybe, and then one from the street or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, or
Sure.
like details of the, you know, windows or, you know, whatever it is that like is important about that structure. Because, you know, like, yeah, certain structures, they're going to get demolished and I'm going to be like, whatever, the windows are from the 80s and I don't care if you photograph those windows, but then there's other structures that have really cool mullion designs or whatever else that we might want documented. So I don't know if there's a way to, maybe it's just that you request that all those detailed photos get taken for everything and then
Yeah,
they're on there and you can suss out whether or not it's important later. But
I think that's an excellent idea. Yeah, I'll start doing that for demolitions, whether it's, you know, whether it appears like a really, I guess, like it has the integrity or not, just go ahead and document it. Because that will also help the commission sort of decide how much of it really remains.
and then, sorry, and this can be a later discussion, but like, where would those resources live after the fact, I guess would be the next, you know, question. But
Yeah, we're
later.
keeping all of our files are digital now, and they're kept in the cloud. So, no, Grace, do you have any, should we pull those specific, you know, files for demolitions and store them in a unique place?
Well, actually, all of our HPC files, we have all of our past paper ones as well that they've been retained, and then we have our digital ones. And this is an internal discussion. The commission probably won't be interested in this, but we are having some discussions whether or not we have a duplicate copy of everything on our internal K Drive server in addition to the cloud. So Carla, we can talk about that offline, and then we can report back to the commission about how they could access those materials. We can have some internal discussions about how to make those accessible if the commission or others are interested.
Okay. And there's also maybe like, I think Preservation Durham, the April, and the volunteers that you have working with you, we've talked about figuring out a way to sort of link our maps with your amazing Open Durham website, and making those available to the public to see as well.
Well, that's a perfect idea. We can also host those photos on Open Durham, and we got a huge funder who's helping with the upgrade for the site as well. So they'd be perfect to be able to, because I didn't know that we weren't already asking those people to document those demolitions with photos, but it's always good because, oh, okay.
But not to the level of detail that I think potentially
we
could do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Katie's, okay. So it's always good because you just never know what somebody's people sometimes are interested in, you know, a lot of details. How many houses had dentals, you know, in this neighborhood, you know, it's whatever it may be. And so, so it's whenever we can get details, that's, it's always good. So, yeah, and we can definitely host those photos on Open Durham and put those up, and it's self-serving, so you can go and upload them yourself for that particular property. And that way, that's done and it's documented for other folks to see.
Very cool. Congratulations on that grant. All right. Thank you so incredibly much, Beth, for coming to speak with us. And this has been a really interesting and helpful conversation, I think, for all of us. And
Good. I'm really glad. Thank you for inviting me. And I do hope that this was helpful. And if you all have any additional questions, you can either contact me or our local government coordinator, Christy Brantley, is a really great resource. And then I know you know her, Carla, and I hope the rest of y'all do too, because she really is such a good public servant and is really good to all of our commissions and local partners around the state.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you very much. And the next portion of this retreat is Krista Kukuro, who will talk about legal procedure. And I think there are a number of topics that we're going to cover in this. So would you like to begin, Krista?
Sure. Before I jump in, do we want to take like a break? 5 minutes. I am happy to entertain a break. I'm also happy to start so you can listen to me drone for an hour about
Let's
legal
take a 5-minute break.
procedure. Okay, I think
Yeah.
that sounds good.
Okay. So we'll get back here at 10:05.
All right. I see a couple of folks are back. I see Matt and Laura. There's April. Okay, we've got hey, Andy. All right, great. I'm going to go ahead and get started. And so, can you all hear me okay? All right. I am not often in the position of sharing my screen. Luckily, that's an advantage of being in the office I'm in. Usually someone else is presenting. So bear with me if we've run into any trouble. But I did prepare a presentation to just talk about kind of various aspects of what you all do, how you do it, mostly as a refresher and kind of as a jumping off point for questions that you are welcome to interject at any point during the discussion. But we'll just sort of move through the PowerPoint. And Carly, if you could help me keep an eye on raised hands, that would be helpful. But also, I mean, feel free to unmute and just like blurt out. Okay, so, all right. We are going to talk just briefly about statutory authority, what the HBC does, talk about criteria and kind of the framework in which you all make your decisions. We're going to talk about how to make decisions, appeals, and then potpourri, which I think is going to be the more exciting part of this. We're going to talk about demolitions, expanding housing choices, and some things that I think the commission has grappled with lately. All right, so let's jump in. So as you know, North Carolina is a Dillon's rule state, meaning that we can only exercise the authority that's given to us by the General Assembly. We do have the authority to create historic preservation commissions, and kind of there's a whole slew of kind of responsibilities or authority that the commission can exercise under that statute. And so the big ones are reviewing and acting on modifications to property, undertaking an inventory of property, and kind of getting involved in ownership of property with the intent to kind of preserve it, pass it along to nonprofits, whatever the case may be, but really with the intent to preserve it. That's not all that's listed in the statute. There's a whole bunch of other stuff like, providing education and community outreach and things like that. But these are the ones that I think are really meaningful in terms of the commission taking action on behalf of the city. And I just, out of curiosity, wanted to see kind of where we're at over time. I didn't go back and look at a bunch of reports, but in terms of 2020 versus 2019, so we had a decline in kind of overall activity. So 2019 was a busier year in terms of applications received and action by the commission. Of course, all those applications didn't make it to the commission. There are a lot of minor COAs that Carla is able to approve. But you can see those numbers here. One of the things that I'm curious about is, and Carla, we didn't talk about this in advance, but the number of demolition applications we have received this year. I don't know off the top of my head what that is, but it just feels like we've had more. I don't know. I just don't know. But I think that will be interesting to see kind of in the summation of this year. And that report's usually prepared in the spring by the board and presented to the JCCPC. Okay, let's jump into decision making. Excuse me.
And
So,
Chris, was those statistics statewide, or are you talking about Durham?
just for Durham, just for this
Okay.
commission. Yeah. So when we're talking about kind of zoning decisions, there's two camps of those. There's legislative decision making, which is really the action that city council takes. It's where a body is legislating. They have a lot of discretion to do so. They're basically making law. And so that could be, you know, text amendments, rezonings, things like that. And there's not really standards for those decisions like you all have to consider. Of course, we have, you know, comprehensive plans and things that guide those decisions. But at the end of the day, there's not, you know, a set criteria that city council or county commission has to contemplate when it's making those decisions. On the other hand, we've got quasi judicial decisions, which is what you all do. It's what the Board of Adjustment does. You know, so to the extent that city council is making law, it's kind of this little box. You all are bound by that box, and you all are making decisions within those standards that have been set by city council. And so there's really kind of two parts to that. There's fact finding and, you know, application of the law to the facts to figure out what the outcome should be. So again, a lot of this is sort of a refresher, and I'll sort of cruise through it. COAs are required for pretty much anything, but a lot of this stuff here listed for any property that's in a district or any property that's a landmark, and COAs are required regardless of whether a building permit is required. And so the COA is just affirming that the project is appropriate for the district or the landmark. And the commission is not allowed to deny a COA except to the extent that a project is incongruous with the special character of a landmark or district. And that's really kind of, that's going to be factual to each case that's being considered, you know, but it's really about the district as a whole, not, you know, not the property that's next door or specific features of the property necessarily. Again, if we're talking about a district. So, you know, that's where the criteria come into play. And so the majority of Durham's historic districts are primarily residential. We've got the districts listed here. You know, unlike zoning standards that are pretty strict, you know, in the UDO, it's shall not type of language. Design guidelines are a little more prescriptive, often written in the form of kind of suggestions or advice. You know, I think our criteria are actually pretty firm in their language, as opposed to some other jurisdictions that I've seen. So an example here is what's listed on the slide. You know, it doesn't say should retain architecturally significant or exposed chimneys. It just says retain. It also doesn't say shall retain. It kind of omits those preceding phrases in terms of being mandatory or suggestive. I think that this is a little bit more forceful in its language, but I think that that's a good thing. I think it gives the commission more footing in terms of making its decisions. Okay. Also in the criteria, there are defined terms and the glossary. And so the glossary is just like, you know, pretty self-explanatory. The defined terms section only includes 4 terms, and they're listed here first. And those are kind of, they're more than the 1 or 2 sentence definitions that you find in the glossary. It's really kind of these paragraphs about what is the commission talking about when it's talking about character defining it. So this section provides a little bit more explanation about how the commission conducts its business. And we're going to talk about feasibility toward the end of the presentation, because I think that ties into kind of the extreme hardship concept for demolition. All right, so for the award-winning prize of bragging rights, does anyone know what the standard is for granting an approval? So this is kind of what the court, like a court would be considering upon appeal. What is it going to look at in terms of the commission having made its decision? What does the commission need to have? And I'll give you a hint. It's like about the evidence. There's 3 adjectives about evidence that we need to have. I see that Matt has unmuted himself, but he looks like he's still contemplating it.
I'm going back on mute.
Okay, I will not make you all suffer in silence. Okay, it's substantial material and competent evidence. And I see some of you shaking your head like this is ringing a bell. So that's good. So let's talk a little bit more about what each of these terms mean. So when we're talking about substantial evidence, and just feel free to unmute yourself, shout it out. What is substantial evidence? What do you think that that means? Andy, you're not
That it's
unmuted.
supported with documentation,
Mhm,
something like
mhm.
that.
I think that's a good guess. Yeah, it's kind of, adequate. Like it's got to be more than just, like speculation or just kind of, especially in the context of Board of Adjustment, like kind of we're talking about experts and things like that. Okay, material. What do we think material evidence is?
I guess what it actually says, material. So whatever material, I'm using the word for definition, but I don't know, material. Just means material. The matter, the matter.
Relevant.
Yeah, it provides the evidence, right?
Not
The
minor,
the physical matter, yeah, physicality of it.
not minor, something sort of goes to the essence.
Okay, great, good. You all doing great. And what about competent? And this one's maybe a little like trickier.
I'll provide the lawyer's perspective. Based on firsthand knowledge, not based on hearsay. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so substantial, relevant, so it would support the conclusion. So this is, again, it's got to be more than like a mere scintilla. There's lots of ways to sort of look at this, but I think at the end of the day, like, is there enough to support the conclusion that the commission makes? And then next, material. So having kind of a connection with the facts. I think I heard maybe Katie say relevant. And then competent. So admissible, not hearsay. Of course, there would be, perhaps there would be an easier way to say these things, like using the synonyms. Like instead of saying material evidence, we could just say relevant evidence. But nonetheless, this is what the General Assembly has identified as the standard for your decisions. So, once an applicant has shown that their application is compatible with the criteria, they are entitled to their COA. So if they have provided substantial material competent evidence, the commission essentially has to grant the COA. And, on the other side of that coin, a denial would also need to be presented or supported by substantial material competent evidence. And, you all are pretty good about this. It would not be, substantial evidence, for example, or just a reasonable basis to make your decision, for there to just be a lot of community support against a project. If a large neighborhood sort of just says, well, we don't like this project because we don't like this developer, that's not rooted in the criteria. That wouldn't be a basis for a denial. So again, this is the big deal. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the decisions that you all make. Process, this is really straightforward. You all do a great job with this in terms of kind of the order of operations. So case is called, staff kind of presents an overview. The applicant provides their evidence, opposition will speak. Cross-examination, we don't really do that in HPC. I think it could be permissible. I think it gets really messy sometimes because you have sort of the applicant and someone who's opposed sort of speaking at one another in a meeting, and that can get out of hand in terms of the chair's management of the meeting. And I'm speaking generally, Matt, I am not speaking about your specific management of the meeting because you're doing a great job.
I appreciate that. Actually, I do have a question though. Cross-examination is permitted by whom? I guess the questions would only come from the commission, right?
I mean, I think that that's how we typically handle it. And I am trying to think if the HPC rules of procedure mention cross-examination in them. Carla, do you know off the top of your head if it's mentioned?
Using those words.
Yeah.
I'll do a quick search of them right now.
Okay. So in the context of BOA, at least, it is cross-examination in either direction by, if the opponents want to question some evidence that the applicant has put on, if they put on an expert and they have their own expert, or even if they just have take issue with, an appraisal of the property value, then they can do like cross-examination. And as you might imagine, it can get hairy. Yeah, April.
Is the rebuttal process considered that cross-examination process? Is that the same or is it different?
That's different. Because it's really, that's more of a, I've given you this information, this other person has given you this information, and now I want to tell you a quick summary of why I think that you need to sort of like disregard or kind of why their information should be discredited, or just perhaps I have some counters to what they have said. It's not really sort of a precise exploration of what it is that they said. It's more of just a quick response about it rather than digging in. But we don't have to spend a lot of time on this. We got other things. We got to talk about demolition. So the hearing is closed, the commission deliberates, staff makes a recommendation, and then the commission makes its decision. And before I move on, Carla, did you find cross-examination? Okay.
No, it was not in there, and I was looking over the sort of procedure, and I didn't really see the back and forth mentioned at all, not even in other terms.
Okay, so I may have misspoken in terms of the rules of procedure. We won't invite people to do cross-examination, but the board is welcome to ask questions, of course, at any point. Okay, more about the process. We swear in witnesses, and that's really to make sure that we have, that kind of competent testimony. Public meeting versus public hearing. The overall meeting is a public meeting. A public hearing is a specific type of public meeting. So the public has the right to attend a public meeting, but not necessarily the right to participate in a public meeting. A public hearing, it does have the right to participate in, and very specific folks have the right to participate. Let me just ask a quick question. So we have a chat. Are you all seeing the chat on my screen? Not the Zoom chat, but the Teams chat.
No.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's just like we do back end kind of like discussion. And so I just didn't want it to be distracting. Okay, so public hearing, obviously applicant and owner, someone with standing has the right to participate in a public hearing. We don't really get into the level of detail of assessing people's standing. It's a very particular and precise kind of legal definition. We really just let anyone who wants to speak. I think there has been maybe one time that I'm familiar with where I think this was Board of Adjustment when Don O'Toole was handling it. He, for an appeal, I think of an administrative decision, made an argument about standing. And the board ultimately decided that the person who wanted to speak did not have standing and they were not allowed to speak at the meeting. And as you can imagine, that especially on big cases, like that's kind of just a PR issue, you know, as we've had issues of relevance to the community. And it can be a delicate thing to determine who might be able to speak because they have legal standing, and then other folks who might want to speak, but aren't legally permitted to speak. So again, we don't really get into that. Hopefully we won't have to. And just more cross-examination there. Okay. Hearsay, you know, the general rule is that a person needs to be present at a hearing to testify. This allows for, you know, for the commission to really hear it straight from a person who has the knowledge and experience with whatever they're speaking about. And I don't think that this comes up a lot at the commission anyways, but I know someone mentioned it earlier when we were talking about the standard for review. So I think it bears mention. There is a special type of class of hearsay that's allowed, which is technical analyses from government officials. Again, I don't think that comes up at the commission a lot, but for example, if our speaker, Beth King, you know, had provided for the board's consideration and some context, you know, an official opinion or report from the state, you know, I think we would be allowed to have that in, even if Beth wasn't there to speak about it, because that's kind of a special class of hearsay that's allowed. But generally not allowed. Sometimes boards and commissions will let it in if it's offered without objection. Not advisable, because if it's hearsay, it's hearsay. Doesn't matter if somebody, you know, pipes up and says whether it is. And then experts, you know, again, this is not something that really comes up a lot for HPC, but, you know, when I'm thinking of demolition and some of the more kind of particular applications that the commission has considered, I think, you know, having expert testimony can be really useful and gives the board, I think, a better basis for making its decisions.
I want to be clear about something. If an expert submitted a report and they were not present at the meeting to speak on the report, is the report, and the expert is not a government official, is the report itself considered hearsay if they're not present to speak?
Technically, yes. Okay. And, you know, and I think you can sort of imagine why, you know, it's useful to have that person there to speak about it. You know, if you as commission members have read the report and you have questions and that person's not there, you're not going to have those questions answered, and that might be important for your deliberation. So it's always the best practice, I think, for applicants to have folks there to speak about whatever kind of expert testimony they may be presenting.
Krista, does that mean that that evidence is not admissible?
Well, unless, this is a tricky question. I mean, the board is supposed to kind of follow closely, but not, you know, strictly the rules of evidence. And I think it would be more proper for it not to be admitted, but I think as a general practice, the commission probably does allow things in like that. I think it's ultimately up to the commission to do what it thinks. Sorry, y'all, I have like something in my throat. Not COVID. I think it's up to the commission to determine kind of where that report's coming from and whether it feels like it needs an expert to speak on it. I mean, I feel like I'm hard pressed to say kind of blanket should not be admitted. I think I like to speak more in the positive, to say like the expert should be there to talk about it. But
the commission can then take into account whether, how much stock they put in it.
yes, right. I mean, I think that that's ultimately how that consideration falls. Because we have, you have testimony, it's just not kind of validated by the person there who might be able to talk with you about it. And so I think ultimately the commission can just give it the weight that it feels like it's due in the absence of additional information or someone speaking about it.
I have one more comment or question really about hearsay. So like the last meeting we had, the applicant stated that there was mold on the property. Now they are sworn in. And even if they're sworn in and they make a statement without a report, without an expert, or anything like that, are we supposed to take that as evidence, or would that also be considered hearsay? And I'm guessing because there isn't any material evidence or anything substantial, it wouldn't be. But I want to know how we're supposed to support that.
That's a good question. I don't think it would necessarily be hearsay. Hearsay would be more like we had, someone come out and assess the property and they told us that there's significant mold. That's, you're receiving information about something that someone else has the original knowledge about, and you're not hearing from that person. I do think, though, that April, you highlighted the problem there. There's not really substantial evidence that someone is saying, yeah, we got mold. Well, I mean, there might be like some mold on something in my fridge. Like, it doesn't, to say that there's mold doesn't really mean anything without more information about what that is. So I don't necessarily think that there would have to be an expert who speaks about, who presents testimony or a report about that. Matt has an opinion. We got.
No, I don't think we need an expert for something like that at all, but April's point in question is well taken. I mean, when an allegation is made like that, that this house is full of mold, and there aren't any pictures in the application or the material supporting the application, I think all of us as commissioners are well within our rights when it's time to question the applicant. Have you observed that mold with your own eyes? Where have you observed that mold? How extensive would you describe that mold? So it's not as good as a picture. Picture, tells 1,000 words, speaks 1,000 words. I'm getting my expression wrong, but I think verifying that observed conditions were actually observed by the person speaking, that at least gets us past a hearsay, obstacle to their testimony, especially if they're giving it without any backup pictures or other documents.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And that's what I was going to say. I mean, I do think kind of photo documentation is going to be really helpful in those instances. Is it necessary? I don't know. I mean, I think that would be sort of the gold standard, perhaps. And I think the commission could ask for that. I think it could continue the case to get that information if it feels like there's not sufficient information otherwise. And so that's really kind of the risk. What?
I got a question, Roy. Do we run the risk of, by taking in photo evidence of saying, all right, we concur that it's mold? I mean, that kind of puts it on us to say, all right, I see that, and yes, that's it. And how do I know it's not green spray paint? I mean, that's, I doubt that's happening, but that's where the expert testimony helps concur.
No, that's a good point. And I think that going back to what Matt said, like, you're not going to the person's not going to, like, the person is under oath, right? And they're going to be presenting the photos to say, like, these are photos of mold that I took. And if it were in fact green spray paint, like, they would be lying under oath. So I think that that's just a, the balance there. And I think, Andy, to me, an expert or some sort of kind of a professional in that field, again, kind of a gold standard perhaps, but recognizing that we have a range of people who come before the commission. I don't think that that's necessary, but again, ultimately, if the commission doesn't feel like it has enough information, it can, hit pause and say, listen, we need you to come back with this, because we don't have, material, substantial, competent evidence. All right, I'm going to move along. All right, I'm going to try to move along. Okay, here we go. Conditions on approvals. You all do from time to time impose conditions. They need to be related to conditions. The conditions need to be related to the approval in some way that kind of brings it closer to compliance. So if there's some reason that the proposal kind of, veers from the criteria and there's a way to sort of bring it back in, kind of bring it closer to what the criteria are intending, that's an appropriate condition. Conditions that would, that aren't related to the criteria and kind of getting close to that would be inappropriate. I'm kind of racking my brain for an example, but, something that's like, would be obvious would be, and the commission should never get into this territory anyways, which is why this is an obvious example. On some sort of landmark property, it's being expanded upon and the commission decides, gosh, this is a really neat addition, but we only want it to be used, for these types of commercial uses, venue, music, entertainment, only during certain hours. That would be wildly inappropriate because it's not, first of all, this commission's purview, but there are not criteria that really govern use. And so it's got to be rooted in those criteria. There's also a recent change in law that the applicant must consent to the conditions in writing. Just as a matter of practice, we also ask them to consent on the record, just so we have that conversation in advance and then they sign off on it later. Okay, deliberating, determine facts, and then apply the standard to those facts. So, you all take, and the motions and everything that you have lays this out pretty well, but, you have to figure out what's going on, what are they asking for, and then how does that meet the criteria? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about standards. Don't say things like, I like this, I don't like this, I feel some way about this, because feelings are not criteria, even though we all have them. And I think that you all are pretty good about that, not kind of making these commentaries on whether you like something or not. You all are pretty good about talking about the criteria.
And Krista, what's your role in real time if and when we say something like that to flag it during a hearing?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if somebody just sort of says that like kind of a one-off, I'm not going to jump on it because, hopefully the conversation sort of moves on in a way that's talking about criteria. But, if commission members get into like, gosh, I like this, or I feel like it meets the criteria, but I don't like it. And, something where it's really, I think, going to actually influence the commission's decision, and it might make an incorrect decision in that it is not basing it on the criteria. That's probably when I would jump in. I take a pretty passive role in these meetings, in part because you all do a great job, and I don't have to jump in. We don't really run into a lot of trouble, but if there's trouble, I'll jump in.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, Motions, again, you all are provided with draft motions, so I don't think that there's, a lot of questions about clarity. Sometimes when we're adding conditions, that gets a little wonky just because we have to do it on the fly. All right. Final decision. This is just kind of everything's in writing, mailed to the applicant. Okay, precedent. I think that this comes up fairly often. So prior decisions by the commission are not legally binding in that each decision is made on its own merits. But I do think that HPC should be cognizant of its prior decision-making because similar cases should have similar results. So if you have kind of a similar factual circumstance regarding house A and it's approved, and then 6 months later, house B comes through and it's pretty much the same. And the commission is just, for whatever reason, really hesitant to approve it. They're focused on characteristic X, Y, or Z about the house. But they didn't do that same kind of hemming and hawing about house A. I think that's just important to be aware of, making sure that we're being consistent, because that's why we have criteria, so that we can sort of use those. We want things to be consistent. We want there to be a level of predictability around decision makings. And if we have similar cases, because sometimes that does happen, and there's a reason why that, we want to have a different outcome for house B, we just need to make sure that we're explaining that on the record. Appeals are by certiorari to Durham County Superior Court within 30 days. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. We go, to court. They're looking at the record. So we're not putting on new evidence in terms of, it's not like a whole new case that the commission heard in front of the judge. The judge is simply looking at the record to see, did the commission have substantial competent material evidence to make its decision? Or was there some other error that was made? Okay, let's talk about potpourri. We've got 17 minutes left. Okay, so demolition, we've been sort of grappling with these. We know that denial is prohibited. That's sort of the baseline in the law, that we only do delay. And that's been the case since the statute's been in place since 1989. And I looked that up just as a kind of legislative history. I was curious whether, there had been an allowance for denial and then something happened and the General Assembly sort of brought their hammer down. But in fact, it's been that way since 1989. And in my, I used to practice in Tennessee and advise we called it the HZC there. And they were allowed to deny demolition. And it's to this day boggles my mind every time we have one of these cases. Which is, I think that at the end of the day, the law can be changed. And I'm not saying that that's something that we need to carry the torch on, but statutes are changed all the time. That probably won't get very far in our General Assembly, but setting that aside. So, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about are these, when can a delay be imposed? When can it be reduced? When does it have to be reduced? And so demolition delay period shall be reduced if the commission finds that the owner would suffer extreme hardship or be permanently deprived of beneficial use or return by the denial, or the structure has no particular significance or value towards maintaining the district. And I think we talked a little bit about that second bullet point with Beth. I'm going to focus on the first bullet point because I think that we talked about this last month with an application, and I think it's going to continue to come before the commission. And generally speaking, the commission does not consider finances, costs when it's making its decisions. But I do think that this kind of concept of extreme hardship is an example where finances can come into play. So there's a lot here on the slide. I think there's kind of a lot to unpack in this. So again, the phrasing in the statute and the UDO that requires the commission to reduce the delay is extreme hardship. We don't have a definition for that. There's no definition in state law. The Board of Adjustment has a criteria for variances about undue and unnecessary hardship. In that case, it can't be a pecuniary loss to the owner due to the regulation that is imposed upon all owners. So what that means is you can't just say, hey, replacing windows is expensive. Using wood windows is expensive, because that's something that would apply, to all owners in the district. That's not specific enough to that owner. So it's really focused on the owner and that particular property. Similarly, demolition by neglect takes into account undue economic hardship, which evaluates where repairs are economically unfeasible. And so, what you'll notice is the BOA criteria and the demolition by neglect criteria use this word undue, which I looked up, and it means unwarranted or inappropriate because of excessive or disproportionate, because of its excessive nature or disproportionate nature, which I think is another way of saying extreme. It's excessive, disproportionate. So I think extreme hardship is synonymous with undue hardship. The demolition by neglect statute does say undue economic hardship. And if we're talking about statutory interpretation, there's perhaps a meaningful difference between saying extreme hardship and undue economic hardship, meaning that extreme hardship potentially encompasses more than economic hardship, but I think at the minimum would encompass economic hardship. So, I'm talking about these things because I think that these are helpful kind of frameworks to make the analysis for the commission in the context of a demolition of what we're talking about when we're talking about extreme hardship. And so again, getting back to demolition by neglect and whether something is economically unfeasible, we can go back to the term that I highlighted at the beginning, that's defined in the criteria, which says feasible means capable of being, I can read it to you or you can read it here, but basically, can it be done in a reasonable period of time, taking into account economic, environmental, social, technological factors. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of wiggle room in there. What's a reasonable period of time? Not defined. But ultimately, it is the responsibility of an applicant to submit evidence to the HPC to show whether something is feasible or whether it's not feasible, I think more so here in the context of demolition, and whether they are suffering an extreme hardship. And I know this was a lot of the conversation at our last meeting is like, well, we just don't have a lot of information here about the hardship. We don't know if it's extreme. You're sort of saying it is, but we don't really have that substantial evidence to make that determination. And so in the context of demolition by neglect, there's actually a laundry list of items that are expected to show undue economic hardship. So kind of the basic stuff, who owns it, what are their financial resources, what are the costs of the repairs, this whole list of kind of painting a financial picture of what the owner's circumstances are, what the property generates, what's needed to bring it into compliance or a level of habitability. So I think that these are useful for making, for the commission to make an evaluation of extreme hardship, because again, extreme hardship, probably a bit broader than undue economic hardship because it doesn't have, extreme hardship doesn't have the qualifier of economic hardship.
Krista, can I ask
yes.
that's tangential but related in my mind?
Mm-hmm.
it's follow-up about a particular case that we heard in the last year, that historic nursing quarters on Broad Street across from Watts Hospital. And the property owner made the case that keeping it would be undue economic hardship, and we approved a demolition. And then we said, but we'd like to help avoid demolishing it. And then I would love an update on what happened, and B, would love some context on what's appropriate and how do we interpret sort of what you're presenting now against our willingness to get involved and help someone overcome this kind of hardship.
Okay, so the first question I think is probably better answered by Carla. What's the status? And then I will probably have you repeat your second question.
You know, so I haven't followed up in, I guess it's been a year, but the last I heard, Urban Durham Realty had been brought into the conversation and they were going to rehab it.
Okay. I see it was for rent now.
Oh,
in
awesome.
A fixed up kind of way. So
great. Yes. So that's what happened. Urban Durham Realty came in and rescued this house.
Cool. Okay. So part two of my question, Krista, is somebody makes the case that keeping something is undue economic hardship, and they meet any number of these bullet points here. And then we as a commission say, but we think this thing is worth digging in more deeply and we'd like to help you, and maybe we can play matchmaker with somebody that has more economic resources. I guess I struggle during our hearings to know when to just say yes and when to try to yes to a demolition and when to try to get involved. And I also, the other part of my question or comment is, as someone that's never met you all in person because I joined during the digital days, like understanding what resources are among us as a commission to play matchmaker or help somebody overcome these hardships to save a building.
So I'll make a few comments, but I think some other folks, including Carla and April, might be able to chime in additionally. I mean, I think, so what we're talking about here mostly is there a basis for the commission to reduce the delay? And so, inevitably, well, not inevitably, I mean, the purpose of the delay, as stated in the statute, and some of the sort of guidance around it, is to come up with a different solution. And I do know that that's like kind of what we talk about during the meetings, but there's not really a set process that happens after a meeting, for example. And we've talked about that internally in terms of kind of initiating that and what that could look like. In the language in the statute, I think is fairly prescriptive in terms of we, as the city kind of commission, are supposed to engage with an applicant afterwards. And, the ideal is something happens like happened with this, Urban Durham Realty kind of jumping in. I don't have enough familiarity to know exactly what resources might be available, but I think one of the things that comes to mind, not only kind of negotiating some alternative to demolition, is like, what about money and grants in terms of rehabbing the property? Like if somebody says, oh, this is an economic hardship, here are my finances, and it truly is an extreme hardship for them, like that means money is needed. And where can that come from? And I think this is kind of the extent of my knowledge. So I don't know if Carla and April, you want to jump in.
Yeah, so historic tax credits are available for contributing properties. I know it was brought up during the hearing on our last case of a non-contributing property. The non-contributing property to a National Register district would not qualify for preservation tax credits. But that is one way to defray the rehabilitation costs of saving a property. I always turn to Preservation Durham when I have a case that's troubling. Preservation Durham has been amazing at reaching out to all of its resources, listing properties on a listserv. April, do you want to go into sort of some of the things that you look at? And I'm happy to also create this list to, send to potential applicants even before they go to Preservation Durham, if that would help reduce traffic
Yeah.
going directly to you.
Well, yeah, so what I was going to say is that it is the responsibility of the HPC to help come up with those solutions. So Laura, everybody is not going to be connected, but sometimes you may have heard from someone who might be interested, who have the resources. It's kind of all of us really kind of putting our heads together on this. But usually Preservation Durham will step in because we probably have those connections, and people call sometimes looking for projects, or we may have a list of people, and we do have a list of people who are looking for such projects. Now, for the Broad Street property, one of the realtors that came to look at the property with us was with Urban Durham Realty, and he didn't update me, so I didn't even know that he found somebody to take the property. So that's good to hear because he hadn't contacted me. So sometimes it also depends on the person wanting to let the property go, because they may still want the land so they can build something new. And we can't force anybody to sell their property or accept the price that someone else is willing to offer. So that's really our process. We don't have funds to give people, but the main thing we do is find somebody else who's interested, who loves old houses, who love challenging projects. A lot of times what we've run into is that the price is too high. They know what they need to put into the property. And that was the problem we had with the Broad Street property. There was 2 people interested, but they wanted way too much for the property, and they had already paid too much for the property based on the things that needed to be repaired. But I'm glad somebody was willing to pay their price. So I really, that's all we can do. We search and find someone, and as long as the property owner is willing to let go of the property, like the property in the last case, I found out, I asked questions and said, no, we did have a conversation. They weren't ready to they weren't willing to sell the property to somebody interested in it. So there has to be willingness, because we can't force. The other thing I was going to ask though, Krista, was that when it comes to economic hardship, I was while you were talking, I was doing a little bit of research to find how it's great if they have this information available to us to review, to make their case for economic hardship. But I saw an article from the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions talking about this kind of thing, and actually the case study was Raleigh. They created a hardship review panel of real estate professionals and financial experts to make that determination. How do can we as a commission, and it made me wonder, I wonder why they did that. Can we as a commission make that determination at our commission meeting, or will we have to create a panel to determine that? I was confused by that, so.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good question. And I was doing some reading also, kind of in making this PowerPoint, and saw that Raleigh has a commission. And you weren't talking about Raleigh, right? Oh, you were. Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't think that the commission is required to create a panel. I think that panel was in regards to demolition by neglect, which is, I see that as much more of kind of like a process. I think when we're talking about the delay in demolition, it's much more of like, it's merely a finding of fact for the commission in terms of, is there an economic hardship? Thus, the way that we'll sort of apply the statute do we reduce the delay? And so I think, to me, it would feel a little burdensome to create a panel. Although I appreciate that this is perhaps not something that can be handled, quickly and lightly. But I think my kind of gut feeling on it is, I don't think a panel is necessary. I think that would sort of add a bit much to this particular consideration for the commission. But I'm open to talk through it more with the commission staff. This is certainly something I think we're going to be dealing with more.
I have a question. So I understand what April's saying, that y'all bring in people with more expertise and more financial capacity. And like in certain cases, yeah, 100%, that's a good option instead. But like in other cases, like let's say somebody inherited their grandmother's house and it's just falling apart because their grandmother, was letting it, was in a state of bad health or something. And they want to live where their grandmother was, but they want to demolish it. I'm giving too much context. But anyways, are there other resources that we can just have as a list, like Carla was saying, that aren't necessarily like, I'm okay with selling this property because it was an investment property anyways. Maybe it's an inheritance thing or something, but like having a good list of other alternatives, whether it's grants or, I don't know, like would be nice. That's not just like bringing in other people who, and I mean, if I'm misinterpreting what you said, April, I'm sorry, but it sounded like you bring in other people to purchase the property and, have the money to put it into the property and the financial wherewithal to do it. But so like, if there is like another way that we can put together a list of like ways that we can help with this economic hardship that, aren't selling the property, I'd be interested in seeing if there's a way to pull a list like that together for the applicants.
Well, yeah, there are very few grants out there like that, but that's a process too. Like this Marion Stedman Foundation loves to do a physical grant, restoration, a rehabilitation grant project, but it better have a good story, and it better have community support, and things of that sort. So they're looking for a story, so if it's just for you to live in, that's tough. That's going to be, if it's going to be an investment property, that's tough. You're not going to find a grant just for that. Now, because of the economy, the way it is going the way it is, yes, self-help has funds, but that's a 2-year wait list to help people with their house repairs. It's just a longer process. If we're talking about finding a solution within a certain period of time, that finding some other investor or maybe someone to partner with them on, let's say it could be an investment property or commercial property. That's just a quicker solution, and that's just what we have to offer. But the commission can, we could work together to come up with a nice list of other options as well, so that the next time something like this comes up, we have something that we can kind of check off and that we vetted and looked through.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, yeah, even if it is an investor coming in and rehabbing it and then selling it back to the people, maybe that's the option. I just know like sometimes it's not the most palatable thing to tell somebody, well, you can just sell your property, like that can kind of rub people the wrong way. So if like at least we have a couple other options on the table, that would be nice. Sorry, my voice.
And to clarify on the limitations that we have as local government, referring people to private parties is also a limitation that we have. So like if we knew of an investor who was interested in rehabbing a property and they've expressed interest in buying up properties, we in the city can't really connect the person with them. That's why we turn to Preservation Durham often for that. But we can, of course, give the general advice. You can find an investor who's interested, if that makes sense.
So I don't want to cut conversations short because I think this is a really useful discussion, but I do know that we're at the end of our time.
This is
Oh,
Tina.
Matt, you're not on mute. I think there's just one last thing that Carla is going to sort of wrap up with. Carla, take it away.
We're not talking about EHC, right? Are we talking about, what is it that you wanted me to?
Oh, sorry. Just like time commitment to the commission.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I think, I mean, a lot of the people that are here aren't having issues with this, but just want to reiterate that this is, our commission hearings can get long, and I try to notify you in advance, and you all did a wonderful job of carving out the time for that last one. But I think in general, our commission hearings, for whatever reason, are going a lot longer than they did pre-virtual. And so just want to reiterate, it's very important that we have the participation throughout the full commission hearing. As you know, there's now a change in what counts as quorum. Once a person leaves, we have lost that person from the quorum itself, whereas before the quorum was set for the entire meeting. So just want to make sure that you are definitely clearing your schedule. We would say until noon is the safest, unless I give you word that it might be longer. It's a safe bet to really clear schedules until noon. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Hey, Carla, I'm back. I had to leave for a few minutes, but yeah, thanks for that. We appreciate everything that you all are doing, and I agree that most of you on this call, we really don't have issues with time commitments. It's very scattered and whatnot. But yeah, our meetings do seem to be going longer, so we appreciate the fact that you show up, and if you could block out your time until noon, I think that's a great suggestion, Carla, like a good baseline to start with, and we'll try to keep you posted if we think that it's going to be a much shorter meeting or a much longer meeting. We might be able to tell you if we only have one case, obviously you can get out a little earlier. So right now we're just busy, and you're not seeing just one case per meeting. So anyway, but we really appreciate everything that you all do. So we appreciate the attendance, the thoughtfulness, and the interest.
Yeah, I've been so impressed with the deliberations that you guys are really being thoughtful and thorough. And so it's been super helpful in getting good outcomes.
Can I make a quick comment? I get it that you need everybody here for this to work. And also, as somebody with a day job that's not related to historic preservation, it can be really hard to clear my schedule for a long block. So I personally am trying to do the balance to make this work. I also, Matt, really appreciate it when you as chair, like, keep us rolling. I know we've got to hear the deliberation, but I'm always cheerleading for you to keep us moving, and can try to help with that if you want my help.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Krista, for a very well-researched presentation. It was awesome.
Yeah, and we didn't cover everything. I mean, we didn't talk about conflicts of interest, and there's so much that goes into what you all do and kind of how it's influenced. But if you have any questions after this or ideas, please let me or staff know, and we would be happy to talk through any of this in more detail.
Yeah, I feel much better that there's at least some type of idea of a list when people talk about economic hardship. So I was struggling with that. So if they put that in the application, okay, submit this to the commission so they have something to work with. So yeah, I appreciate that. Makes me feel better. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you in a
Enjoy the
couple weeks.
rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.